Some early announcements of this talk said it would be introduced by Susan Pfeiffer. I'm not Susan Pfeiffer, though sometimes when we're together, people have thought we were sisters. Anyway, Susan couldn't come today, but she asked me, and I'm very happy to be doing it. I'm Sarah Shuttleworth, by the way. But the idea of asking Ron Williamson to speak came from Susan Pfeiffer, and she has provided me with a handy crib. I don't usually read introductions, but this time I will. So she and Ron have worked on archaeological projects in Ontario since the 1970s. At that time, Ron was a doctoral candidate at McGill, supervised by Bruce Trigger, who was a remarkable scholar with a global reputation in both the peoples of ancient Egypt and the less ancient people who lived in what is now Ontario prior to the arrival of Europeans. And I wanted to say this is a great week to be having this talk when really ancient people have gotten the Nobel Prize, in case you weren't noticing what happened on Monday with the award to Sventi Paavo for ancient DNA. So Ron has carried on Trigger's tradition of fieldwork informed by deep reading of historical texts, but not in academia, but he chose the novel path of commercial archaeological consulting. Ontario's first Heritage Act had been passed in 1975, and the demand for mitigation of cultural heritage sites would grow and grow. So lots of times he'll probably tell us more about this when something's being developed. If it's suspected to include any kind of ancient site, or including, I guess, not just Indigenous sites, the investigations have to be done first. So Ron founded Archaeological Services, Inc., a cultural resource management firm, and they have directed hundreds of archaeological surveys, excavations, and comprehensive heritage resource assessments on lands throughout Ontario and New York and Michigan, dealing with sites of all cultural and temporal periods. He has played an important role in regional planning, helping town and city planners craft master plans that take heritage resources into account. Among his many books, one that sounds like it would be great to get hold of is Toronto, a short illustrated history of its first 12,000 years. All right, Ron, maybe you tell us more about that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Susan, through Sarah. I've worked with Susan for a long time, as she pointed out, since the 70s, and we've co-authored many articles and many books as well. I think I'm going to have to take my glasses out so I hit the right button. So I'm here to talk to you today a bit about that kind of long Indigenous history of Toronto, but really I can't talk just about Toronto. It's about the GTA and South Central Ontario. And in particular about the land acknowledgement for the city of Toronto and for this general area and the complexity that is in that land acknowledgement. First, I want to say, though, that in recent years, I've been doing a version of this lecture, perhaps less complex, with Carolyn King, who is a former chief of Mississauga the Credit, as part of our work together in a not-for-profit called Shared Path Consultation Initiative, which is trying to bring municipal land planners into contact with all of the First Nations that they should be speaking with about land development in their jurisdiction. So a lot of what I have done in the last few years since I retired I guess that's not really retiring, but is talking to municipalities, talking to corporations about bringing those two agencies together. In so doing, I realize that's far better in making a presentation like this about Indigenous history to also have an Indigenous person here presenting that. And so I just wanted to make the point that I'm completely clear about the fact that I'm a white academic old male sitting in front of you and not an Indigenous person making this. But most of the time I do this with Carolyn. Here is the land acknowledgement for Toronto. Now I'm with a particularly bright audience today, but I can tell you that if I ask most of the time who these various people are, I get met with a blank stare. Who all of these nations that we're acknowledging in the Toronto acknowledgement. And people generally think about it, just the spirit of it. Okay, we're acknowledging the people that have been on this land, and they don't really know the history. But it's important to know that history, and it's important because in the true spirit of reconciliation, and I'm aware that you had quite a good lecture last week about that, you know, just saying a land acknowledgement is not reconciliation. And so it'd be good as a start to understand the land acknowledgement. Who are these people? The Mississauga, the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, Wendat. Who are all those people? So I'm going to tell you about the various periods that those nations occupied the Toronto area, Southern Ontario, and in so doing, explain the complexity of that land acknowledgement, but also the complexity of the history of this area. People have been here for 13,000 years, calendar years. These are the archaeological sites that are in the provincial database. Some are within the green belt and some are outside of the green belt. That whole dense band of sites just south of the green belt is because of development over the last 3 decades. And the work that firms like mine did to identify and mitigate impacts to archaeological sites in advance of above land development or inland development. The relative absence of sites in Toronto is because, of course, much of Toronto was developed without any of this kind of assessment where sites would be identified. But this gives you a picture, if you like, of the density of sites, especially when you kind of look along the Rouge, which you can see in that extension of the green belt down the Rouge.
Sorry, I need you to speak right into.
Okay, so I'm not quite loud enough. Here we go.
Online, it's not loud enough. So
Okay. So that density that you see along the Rouge Valley is probably the density, is probably a result, A, of the Rouge Valley being the pre-contact 401, 400 series highway. But secondly, it's because of all of the survey that's been done in that area. So a map like this is always a reflection of both of those things. But as I said, people have been here for 13,000 years, which is, of course, the oral tradition of all the First Nations. We have always lived here. As far as Western science can say, people have lived here as long as it has been possible to live here. These are the two creation stories of the Anishinaabe and the Iroquoians. I'm going to go into some detail about the differences between Iroquoians and Anishinaabe, which is Algonquian. Those are two language families. And, but you'll see that in both stories, we end up on the back of the turtle, and that the world we live in is Turtle Island. And that's why those garbage trucks you see going through the city that have Turtle Island, I mean, that's where all that comes from. It comes from these indigenous creation stories. the first absolutely kind of unambiguous, unequivocal evidence for human occupation in the Americas. And it's true that if you pick up any professional archaeological journals or even National Geographic or any of those journals, you will see debates about the earliest occupation of the Americas. This is the first unequivocal evidence, really. These footprints date somewhere between 21 and 23,000 years ago. And it was an article published in Science, and it caught all of us, caught all of our attention, because it put to rest that whole debate about were there people here in the Americas prior to what's known as Clovis about 13,000 years ago. The answer is yes. We don't know the extent of that occupation, but we're learning more about that through genetics. Prior to that discovery, there had been isolated incidents of material that seemed to be earlier, but this was the data set that most people knew about in terms of the earliest occupation of the Americas or of North America. That material between roughly 12 and 13,000 years ago was found in a number of sites. So the red dots are the location of sites, and then that kind of shading along the Mississippi and Ohio area, that's the number of actual points of that period that have been found. What's interesting about that is this map is also a reflection of where's all the survey been for development for public sector projects, and that's in the east in that kind of built up area, as opposed to Western North America, where there's been less of that kind of work. So for Ontario, these red triangles represent the locations of points that date to that general time period. So you can see that there's been quite a lot of material dating to 13,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago found in Southern Ontario. Now this slide was made a few years ago, and you'll see that find spots means an isolated point, probably lost in hunting, projectile point lost in hunting, versus actual sites where we can see that people actually were camped there for some duration. And there's only 49, and there's probably only 2 or 3 more sites since this slide was created. So there's maybe 50 to 55 sites of this time period where there is substantial evidence of people living. The sites that have been excavated are usually around former glacial lake shorelines, and we'll get to that in a second. But they suggest the exploitation of both extinct megafauna and caribou and Arctic fox. You can see mastodon in the lower right, caribou, the famous painting by Ivan Koshis, who did it for a book, colleague of mine, Peter Stork, called Journey to the Ice Age. Really recommend that as a good book to read about the early hunt for sites of this period. I want to talk a little bit about 2 sites. One of them is Mount Albion West, but the star is the Rogers site. That kind of slashed area along the north shore of Lake Erie is the Onondaga Formation, and that's where Onondaga chert or flint comes from, and that's the most popularly used flint, frequently used flint in all of that 13,000 years of history. And here are the artifacts from that Rogers site, and the kinds of projectile points and tools that are found here and the cherts that were used to make those points speak of this possibly being the oldest known site in Ontario, which would make it around 13,000 and a little bit more years ago. So you have Flint Ridge and Upper Mercer cherts from Ohio, and you have Pennsylvania jasper. Now there's not a lot of it. The rest of it is Onondaga from the north shore of Lake Ontario. But the fact that those points are made from those cherts, and those cherts are to the south, and the styles make this site as the probable earliest site in Ontario that we have to date. But I want to talk to you about Mount Albion West, which you see here, and off to the right, kind of near Rochester, is the Hiscock site. Hiscock is very interesting. Richard Loeb from the Buffalo Museum of Science has spent about 35 to 40 years looking at this site, literally a life's work. And you can read here what he has found. Suffice to say, he has found the same period or artifacts from the same period. He's found mastodon bone that has been worked and mastodon bone that has evidence of working by these tools, butchering. It does not mean he claims or he acknowledges that he hasn't found evidence of these animals being killed there, but he's found evidence of them being used, at least their skeletal material. So at this time, 13,000 years ago, the Lake Ontario shore was about 20 to 25 meters or kilometers further out. So if you see the little dot, Hamilton, you know, you've got the actual shoreline a considerable distance to the east. So that would have been visible from high points. So for example, the Niagara Escarpment. So Peter Stork, previously mentioned, spent quite a lot of time in his career at ROM trying to find sites along that Niagara Escarpment that would be occupied for longer periods of time, because people were using them to survey the basins of the Great Lakes, and they could see herds of caribou, or they could see mastodon and mammoth. So we found a site while working for the city of Hamilton in advance of their Red Hill Creek Expressway. So when you're driving along the QEW, remember the Red Hill Creek Expressway. You may also remember the debates about putting that expressway in, because it was a large, beautiful valley that was going to be impacted by this 6-lane highway. At the very top of that valley was a site called Mount Albion Falls, and beside the falls is this site called Mount Albion West, which is a 13,000-year-old site. And these are the fluted points that were found from that site. But more importantly, we took the tools from this site and submitted them for blood protein residue analysis. And lo and behold, this particular tool, which is a tool called a graver. It's made out of a chert that shows up in the bedrock around Collingwood. But that blood residue off of this tool was identified as proboscidean, meaning elephant. So it's either mammoth or mastodon. We tried doing further DNA, digging down a little bit deeper with the wash and see if we could find or identify whether it was mammoth or mastodon through DNA work. We couldn't, but it is proboscidean. It's the first time in Ontario that we have a tool off a site that has that kind of residue on it. So it was an important find. So here's where I do 7,000 years in 2 slides. Following the Paleo-Indian period, there is a warming of the climate, and we get an environment much more like the one we have today. In that previous period, when it was caribou and mastodon, the environment in southern Ontario was more like Arctic tundra, like an open spruce forest kind of environment, and that's what people were living in and hunting in. With time, by about 9,000 years ago, the climate had changed enough that population began to expand. There were far more resources available for people. Possibly more people moved in, of course. And so we have a period of about 7,000 years where we have small hunter-gatherer populations that are occupying the major river valleys of southern Ontario, and their lifestyle is a nomadic one, usually with some kind of spring agglomeration when they can get together in larger numbers around a particularly rich resource like spawning fish. And it's a time when, you know, exchange of marriage partners, et cetera, would have happened, as opposed to other times of the year when resources were a little more scarce and people were in smaller groups across the landscape. You will note here, that we believe that these are Algonquian speaking people. I'm coming to that. But I want you to read the line below, which is astronomers, artists, hunter-gatherers, foragers. The astronomers and artists is in there, not because we have any evidence of that, but because these are human beings that were living at that time. And archaeologists have a habit of describing people only by their economy based on what they can find on the landscape and the tools that survive. The only tools that survive are ones that are inorganic, or very occasionally bone that survives. Wood does not, and fabric does not. And so we really have a very limited picture of the lifestyle of these folks. No doubt they were interpreting the sky, and no doubt they had art. We know that 3,000 years ago, the art from these people was quite dramatic. There are sites all over Toronto that date to these various periods. In Vaughan, just the city above Toronto, they call themselves. There is this site that's about 9,000 years old. There's actually a number of sites where you'll see that the projectile points in the lower left here all have their tips broken. This is a place where they were bringing animals back and retrieving the projectile points. The tips are broken off, left in the animal. The animals are butchered. And about 100 meters away, there was actually another cluster of tools where they're largely scrapers of the same period, where they were scraping hides and processing the hide. So we had a bit of a glimpse of lifestyle at that site, at least as it related to their economy. The Eglinton Flats has been a place where people have looked for material on the Humber River for hundreds of years, as long as settlers have been here. So include the image from the upper left, which obviously is a historic image, but it gives you a sense of what these little settlements would have been like that I'm describing here. You would have had not teepees, you would have had kind of smaller bark covered structures, but it would be beside the rivers. There would have been canoes, and rivers would have been the main form of transportation, of course, by canoe. So these are sites that are scattered across the landscape over this 7,000 year period. And with time, there are more of them, and we learn more about them the later they get. One thing I want to make a point about is their art. I said a moment ago, we don't see much of that, but it is reflected in the ground stone industry. Starting about 3,000 years ago, we find objects that, quite frankly, rival any of the art found in the world at this time period. This is quite dramatic stuff. These objects are not much more than about 8 inches, 6 to 8 inches. The one in the upper right is quite honestly the most beautiful artifact I think I found in my career. It's a black slate, banded slate, and that's natural geological banding. That's an orange band, and it's symmetrical. On the other side, it has the same banding, and it was on a copper necklace. So it was just a stunning object. And I can imagine the day somebody's walking along, probably the Georgian Bay shoreline, and sees a block of that slate, and they're kind of visualizing this beautiful arrowhead shaped pendant that might go on a copper necklace. And if that's not art, I'm not sure what is. Not a good idea to put your cold water beside a hot projector. So who were these early people? And it's important to understand that there are 2 linguistic families in Northeastern North America, Algonquian and Iroquoian. They're different structures, and they're basically unintelligible to one another. They're quite different. So one of them pertains to Algic ancestry, and that's the Algonquian. And these are the nations. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but you know, the Cree, the Ojibwa, and other groups to the east as well, including Mi'kmaq, that spoke a form of language which we know as Algonquian. Oh, thank you, Linda. You got me a cold one. Thanks. Well, not a cold one as we know, but a cold glass of water. So I'm going to take a lot of very detailed research and summarize it, which is that based on linguistics research, probably 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, the Proto-Algic language moved and spread eastward. And if we believe the genetic evidence, probably north, if you think of north of the border and moving eastward, we get the movement of this language with people moving that in that direction and taking new point styles, projectile point styles, which we can trace. And so we believe that a lot of this developed in the Columbia Plateau, and there's been more research recently that links some of the BC coastal languages and this, the Wyatt Yurok on the west coast of North America and California with Siberian languages, so that there's still even more emerging linguistic evidence of that ancestry. But you'll note that this Algonquin ancestry does not extend into southern Ontario. So a very early study by Frank Siebert in the 60s demonstrated through kind of a lexical analysis that the homeland of Proto-Algonquian, which developed out of Proto-Algic, was in kind of southern into the near northern Ontario and the northern part of the Michigan Peninsula. This is based on plants and animals that are words in the language that only occur in the environment of that area at this time. So that becomes a real clue as to where the Algonquian language started. That, and remember, that includes all of the Ojibwa, the Chippewa, the Cree, all over to the East Coast. And so it becomes a challenge to try and figure out how we go from this area across Northeastern North America. Well, there's a complication. And the complication was first articulated by a colonizer, by L'Allemand in the Jesuit Relations in 1643, when he noted that the tribes of the Huron tongue, and by that he means Iroquoian, almost seemed to be only at the center of a vast circumference filled with Algonquian tribes. And so they're noticing that what you have is, as you see on this slide, the Huron, Petun, Neutral, and the 5 nations in central New York State, which we know as the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, they're surrounded by people who speak Algonquian, a completely different language than theirs. So how did this come to be? So people began in the late 70s following on the work on Algonquian, Proto-Algonquian language, to try and figure out with language the homeland of Proto-Iroquoian. And you can see how it overlaps, but it also is very similar to the distribution on the ground of archaeological materials that we identify as Iroquoian, archaeologists identify as Iroquoian. So when this study came out in the late 70s, I was in graduate school. We were all kind of excited to see this linguistic work coming out. More recently, 2 researchers at the University of Toronto spearheaded a really fascinating study. This is Michael Scalacci and Geneviève Dewar from the Department of Anthropology here, with a linguist from Kansas, from the Wyandot, and a few other folks, to look at the overlap, and their focus was on the Iroquoian language and the origin of the spread of those languages from that Proto-Iroquoian center. So again, he used a quantitative analysis of lexical data, same kind of approach that has been used historically. And he's looking at they're looking at historical relationships between the various dialects of Iroquoian. And so you see this overlap area that is their area overlapped with that of Boole, the 1979 PhD dissertation. And their work suggested that the actual center or foci of the Proto-Iroquoian language was central New York State, which is the homeland of the New York Iroquois, or who we call the Haudenosaunee. So they then speculated about the timing of the Northern Iroquoian language divergences, and they seem to correspond with the first evidence of the use of corn. So if you think about that for a minute, Iroquoians in central New York State are getting corn probably first from the Mississippi Valley, who are getting it from Mesoamerica. It makes its way into the people living in central New York State. They develop an Iroquoian lifestyle, and then it's introduced into Ontario populations. And what's happening is the language the people are speaking in central New York State is moving with the corn agriculture technology. So if you look at the Wendat, the notion is that that's happening somewhere between, say, 200 BC and AD 770. And if you're looking at, for example, the first maize that we have in Ontario, it's about 570 AD. So one problem with this study is that they talk about a divergence of Cherokee, which is an Iroquoian language. It's a distant Iroquoian language, being about 4,000 years ago. So most linguists and most scholars who look at this material think that seems unlikely that that language spread southward rather than from south to north. But their work is pretty convincing, and it also seems to agree with genetics. Before I talk a little bit about the genetics, I just want to make the point that, and I'm going to review some of this, that this area was also home to the Huron-Wendat and their ancestors. Now, who exactly those people were before they became Iroquoianized, if you like, because I'm talking about corn and language coming at the same time into southern Ontario around 500 AD, then we have to think about, well, who are the Huron-Wendat? So one of the things that separates them from other Iroquoian peoples, like the Haudenosaunee of central New York State, is that they had these things called ossuary burials, or feasts of the dead, where they would take everybody who had died for about a 20-year period during the occupation of the village, and they would take these people and rebury them in a secondary burial and create a village of the dead. And they would then forever have responsibilities towards that area because one soul stays with each body. So it's literally, they believe that it's a living village, but it's a village of the dead. One of the projects that Susan and I collaborated on a fair amount, obviously, is the Moat Field ossuary, which was located near Leslie and Highway 401. And this is an ossuary that dates to the early 14th century, 1300 to 1320, something like that, that had almost 100 people in it. And it was the first time that this had been looked at in kind of the modern era. A lot of ossuaries had been excavated in the late 1800s and just desecrated by people looking for skulls and the grave goods that might be buried with them, especially if it was in the historic period, because you would find things like brass pots in these ossuaries. So it's a fairly dark period, and not unlike many of the other colonial aspects of us and Indigenous peoples in this land. But in this case, we were doing this under the direction of Indigenous elders from 6 nations. And we mapped every single bone in this ossuary in layers using the technology available at 2000 in 1997. I look at the technology available today and I shake my head at what, the time we could have saved. We were mapping this and then translating that in CAD, et cetera, to create layers of this ossuary. It still went very well. Back to the origin story, there was only one artifact in this ossuary, and it was a complete pipe beside the eldest skull at the bottom of the ossuary. And it was this turtle effigy. So obviously, this village had been created on the back of the turtle, just like modern life. So let me just turn briefly to the DNA evidence. Sarah, your comment was so apt, because now ancient DNA is changing our understanding of this history amazingly. And with every year, there's new and more insightful perspectives on how the land was occupied. In this case, this paper, we looked at 91 ancient human genomes, and myself and a scholar from the Huron-Wendat, who actually runs their territorial office, he's a PhD in biology. We participated in this project and provided about a dozen samples of Hurons. And so this was the first time really we had Iroquoians as well as Algonquians, what we thought were Algonquians, mainly mtDNA. And so an international team produced modeling of how people came across using these new data. And I'll just turn your attention to D, which is the model that we chose as the most likely model of people coming along the coast, and then roughly 13 or 14,000 years ago, and then one group heading east and another group heading south. And there may have been some circulation back, but imagine kind of working out the linguistics as you look at that map. So the people that by 7,000 or 8,000 years ago living in the Columbia Plateau area are speaking a form of Algonquian, a very early form of Algonquian, meaning Proto-Algic, but they then are moving eastward. This doesn't help us with Iroquoian at the moment, but what that shows you is the kind of two groups that are spreading through North and into South America. You're looking here at that Southern Ontario ancient DNA data beside modern Native Americans. The problem with modern Native Americans when you do DNA work is, of course, the admixture of colonial populations. And then modern Siberians in the lower right. So here we're looking at the sites that were used in this study, which is, and actually this is starting to show you data that have not yet been published. So we're looking at 3 ossuaries and a fair number of samples from those ossuaries, these, which is 5, 6, and 7, and these are Huron-Wendat ossuaries. So we're extracting teeth from the populations in those ossuaries and using them to do aDNA. Obviously, we're getting mtDNA when we can, mitochondrial DNA while we can as well. And then 2 sites that are thought to be Algonquian, the Lucier or the Hind and Sartori site, but number 8, the Lucier site is work that Geneviève Douard has done from University of Toronto previously. So we have that as comparative data for Southern Ontario ancient data. So what you should be able to see here pretty quickly is that there's very little, the admixture plots for people from 1, 3, and 8 who are traditionally thought of as Algonquians looks hauntingly similar to the ones for the Iroquoians. So like previous studies, Susan and I had done a little bit of work with a geneticist out of the University of California about 10 years earlier with mtDNA, and we had concluded then, and this is also showing that by 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, people genetically were pretty much the same. So it's not like we're ever going to be able to say, okay, that's an Iroquoian on the basis of genetics, and that's an Algonquian. There was a bit of more detailed work done with some of the clades in the haplogroups. I think, well, AC or A, B, C, and D are the 4 haplogroups that are well known for North American native populations, as well as X. And X2A shows up only in Northeastern North America. Well, at least it was first thought that until a more recent find in Central North America, Kennewick Man, the famous one that was the subject of lots of debate, he actually turned out to be largely X2A. So it put to rest the notion that X2A was just Northeastern North America. But I want to just draw your attention to the C1C or the C4C1, and you're seeing the mix of kind of Lucier and glacial Kame people with these kind of variants of these haplogroups. And what this is telling us, and the X2A as well, we have somebody from one of the Huron ossuaries from Staines Road who's got X2A. In the very beginning, it was thought that X2A might be an Algonquian marker, but I think it's becoming more and more clear that it's not, and that everybody starting about 4,000 years ago looked alike genetically. One of the things that was fascinating was looking at that one particular clade with C1C, where we have Moat field mixed in with Beothuk. And there was a study done about maritime archaic. So these would be populations living 4,000 to 2,000 years ago in the east coast of Canada, in the maritime coast of Canada. And the people who were recognized historically as Beothuk, who lived on Newfoundland, that there's no link between them genetically. And so that became quite interesting. But in our study, we're finding Huron-Wendat folks linked with Beothuk. Now, that doesn't mean this is happening in historic times. This is happening 4,000 years ago. So what's interesting is that it sheds a little bit of light. And when we publish this, it'll shed a little bit more light on the fact that the Beothuk came from wherever the Wendat populations also came. And if the Wendat populations are mixed and look like the Algonquian populations, if we go to the language, then does it mean that corn and the language, Iroquoian language, was introduced to genetically Algonquian people in Southern Ontario, which is what it seems like. So all of this is fairly interesting. But just to think about the Beothuk thing for a moment, to find this Moat field ossuary and to find genetic information that links with the Beothuk, the Huron-Wendat believe that they're very closely allied or linked with the St. Lawrence Iroquoians. These are the people that Jacques Cartier found living in the St. Lawrence in the 1530s, who Champlain did not see. And there was this big mystery as what happened to the St. Lawrence Iroquoians. But they had shared cognates with the Beothuk. So if we're talking about events from 4,000 years ago, it's interesting to find this genetic link and to know that there's a linguistic link between the St. Lawrence Iroquoians and the Beothuk as well. So I'm going to come back to that. But all of that is telling you we have Algonquians, we have Iroquoians. We're starting to sort out the stories of the differences between them genetically, where they were, and trying to understand how it was that we ended up with these Iroquoians in the middle of all these Algonquians. let's go back to Maize for a second and the difference in lifestyle for Iroquoians from the nomadic lifestyle of Algonquians. So it looks like about 2,200 years ago, it hit Ontario, Maize, that is. And the very first thing we start seeing are small base settlements. These are places where maize was grown, populations grew. It was probably a year-round settlement, but people were free to go and live in other places and harvest naturally occurring resources. And the very first base settlements are all over southern Ontario. This is what they look like. Imagine the longhouses in that previous slide are these little structures that are showing up on these. So 11th century into the 12th century. But the thing I want to point out is that bottom bullet point, which is that all of these sites have large, deep pits full of corn. So what it's telling us is that even by this period, there's a lot of corn being eaten in the diet. Because we don't have human remains from this period, we're not sure. We can't do kind of the calculations to figure out how much of the diet is corn based on isotopic analysis, but it's obviously ubiquitous at these sites, and it's influencing the way they structure their settlement system. All of these sites are settlements and villages of the Huron-Wendat prior to them moving into Huronia in Simcoe County. That's where they're found in the historic period, but ancestrally, their main, the main source for the people who become the Huron-Wendat are these sites here. So these are ancestral Huron-Wendat villages. The best way to explain this is a 1920 Newfoundlander. They're not Canadian, they're Newfoundland, but within 30 or 40 years, they become Canadians. They join the Confederation. So these are communities that are autonomous, they're networked, they have their own names, they're not Huron-Wendat, we call them ancestral Huron-Wendat, but starting around 1400s, they are forming into a confederacy known as the Huron-Wendat Confederacy. Many of them are up there 100 years before that into that Simcoe County area. Many of the sites, however, are small sites, not unlike the base settlements. There may not be palisaded, but there's 4 or 5 houses. And then a curious thing happens. They all begin to coalesce into much larger villages. So this is a parallel with what happens in the Neolithic period in Europe, as is, by the way, the introduction of corn technology with language. That also is true of the Neolithic revolution in Europe. So what we're looking at here is a village that forms by the addition of many of those pre-coalescent little settlements. And this site is where the Pickering Airport was going to go in. That's where this site is located. And so it was excavated in totality in the 1970s in advance of that airport that never occurred. This is what it would look like. So some of these reached 9, 10 acres in size, hundreds of acres of cornfield around their settlement. But what happened on these sites that is curious is a huge 50-year period where there is lots of scattered and butchered and burned human remains and lots of human bone artifacts. And so, like elsewhere in the world, that conflict, which has spread across Iroquois in New York State, it's in Ontario, it's in the St. Lawrence Valley, everybody forms these large villages as a defensive mechanism against that kind of hostility. And then by the next 50-year period, it's died back down, as you can see here. Although human bone artifacts pick up again in the 1600 to 1650 period, when the violence between the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois and the Huron-Wendat escalates. So over about 100 years, you get these pre-coalescent villages forming into these what we call coalescent villages, which is the that Draper site. And then we get a site called Mantle, which is in Whitchurch Stouffville, which we excavated in 2003 and 2005. A PhD student of mine named Jennifer Birch studied the site and realized that the site was very much a post-coalescent aggregate of people. The site, now called Jean-Baptiste Lenné, the Huron renamed the site, 7 acres in size, 95 houses, maybe 50 at any one time, 60,000 posts needed to create this community. Imagine the bark required. 1,200 features, meaning pit features that had to be excavated. The people living in this village would require roughly 6,000 to 7,000 deer hides annually to clothe them and to create moccasins and for bedding. That is not possible to get out of your immediate environment. So they're trading with Algonquians to the north. What do they trade? Well, if we believe what they tell us in the historic period, they're trading maize. And so they have to create not only the maize for themselves, but they have to create maize for Algonquians to the north. And they have to create enough maize that they can feed themselves if there's a famine year. And so the question becomes, well, how much does maize contribute to the diet? I'm not going to show you a whole lot of slides about this. I'm just going to tell you that isotopic analysis, looking at the plant in the diet of people, we're seeing that about 50 to 55% of the contribution of diet is maize for people at this time period. What does that translate to? It translates to 1.5 pounds of corn per day per person. For a village of 1,800, you do the math, you need 2,500 to 3,000 pounds of corn per day. So what does that mean? It means this. That's Young and St. Clair in the middle. That's the cornfields for that village. I could show you this in Stouffville, but you're not familiar with the landscape. So this one helps. It's absolutely extensive. It's one of the reasons that when you sometimes visit these recreations, I don't know if any of you have been to a recreation of an Iroquoian village like at Crawford Lake, or there are ones in other areas, and they have these little garden plots that are about the size of this room. And, you know, when you think about it, these villages have 2 kilometers of corn around them. And in fact, Sagard, Gabriel Sagard, is a Recollet priest who spent the winter in 1623, 1624 with the Huron-Wendat. And Sagard would get lost, and he would complain. He wasn't lost in the forest, he got lost in the cornfields, moving from village to village. So here's where people were kind of in 1600, the dark kind of orangey color. So you have the Haudenosaunee living in New York State. You have the Wendat up in Huronia, but you'll see this big yellow area, which is their ancestral territory. You have the neutral around the west end of Lake Ontario and Niagara Peninsula, and a couple of, other groups in the kind of Niagara area on the American side. So think back to that land acknowledgement: Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Algonquian, the Mississaugas. So we don't have Mississaugas living in this area yet. So we're going to move into this period. So when Champlain arrives in North America, he engages in the traditional warfare between the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. The Huron-Wendat being allied with the Algonquin of the Ottawa Valley and other Algonquin allies to the north, Algonquian allies to the north. So this is an encounter that occurs on the Richelieu, where at Lake Champlain, Champlain and 2 of his fellow explorers join with that group to attack the Haudenosaunee in what is likely an Onondaga village. And this was an illustration of that encounter that was obviously done much later. and probably drawn in the 1660s or 70s. The palm trees are quite interesting in the background, as you can see. And those canoes, which are meant to be, the canoes of these various groups, look more like the boats in Paris on the Seine. So, and hammocks weren't something that was ever recognized by folks. So it's an interesting image, but it marks the beginning of European involvement in that warfare. And remember, the French are involved themselves with the English, who are further south on the eastern seaboard. And so what eventually happens is a mapping of geopolitics of the European war between the French and the English, and it's mapped on these populations who then escalate warfare, and warfare becomes less about feuding and revenge and more about wiping out people from a whole area because of the fur trade. So major population movements, and the Wendat and the Tinantante, or the Petun, who lived in the Collingwood area beside them, and the Neutral and their Algonquian allies, are dispersed out of Ontario between the late 1640s and 1650s. And these encounters have been counted and marked and mapped. There's a scholar from New York State named Joseph Brandow who did it. And more recently, I focused on encounters on the North Shore of Lake Ontario in a new book on the Iroquois du Nord, who are the Haudenosaunee villages that get established after the dispersal period. And you can see here, so up there in Huronia, between Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay, there are 25 separate attacks and encounters between the Haudenosaunee. One of the points that I was making about this is that the Haudenosaunee were completely familiar with the Southern Ontario landscape. They didn't need guides. And here's a map of 1688 that's showing those Haudenosaunee villages on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. Ganastigan is at the mouth of the Rouge, and Tagon is Bobby Point in Toronto. So remember our land acknowledgement, the Haudenosaunee, traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee. Well, this is the period that the Haudenosaunee are in Southern Ontario and have established these villages all the way down to almost the Kingston area, certainly PEC, Prince Edward County, in Kente. And this is the kind of material culture that is found on those sites: brass kettles, projectile points, Jesuit rings, religious medallions, lovely antler cones, kind of bottom right area, wampum belts, still getting some ceramics, but in styles that are of that period, and lots of glass beads. And this is the material culture that are on these sites that we're able to link between these sites and the Haudenosaunee homeland. So what happens when the Iroquois leave? They're being attacked by the French in their homeland, by Denonville. There's a calculated French movement against the Iroquois because the Iroquois had stopped, or the alliance between them and other natives, Western Indians, had evaporated. So the Mississauga participate in pushing the Iroquois out of Southern Ontario, and they take over the Southern Ontario area. They've come from the North Shore of Lake Huron, as you're seeing in this slide. And all those sites that are along the North Shore are now occupied by Mississauga. And note, Five Nations aren't here. They're not back until the 1700s, when they're given land grants in relation to loyalists of the American Revolutionary War. In 1701, there's 3 treaties that are signed. There's a treaty between native groups only. There's something called the Nanfan Treaty, which was only the British and the Haudenosaunee. And then there's the famous one called the Great Peace of Montreal, 1701, which is the kettle with one spoon. And the kettle with one spoon is where all of these nations you see here on this map participate together to argue that they will share the land and violence will stop between the various nations and ostensibly the French and English. Of course, it's everybody who's there has different agendas and different objectives. And I have to say, my view of this is that the Haudenosaunee were by far the best and most skillful strategic interpreters at this time, or negotiators at this time. The Nanfan Treaty they signed with the British in case the British win, ultimately, and they're guaranteeing their relationship with the British. They go to Montreal in case the French win, ultimately, and they negotiate there. And then they just, nevertheless, agree with their native allies that they're going to share the area. This after a century of Haudenosaunee aggression all across the landscape. So it's a fascinating period. They had suffered losses due not only to disease, but also all these other nations kind of gathering together to fight them. There's the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is when there is supposedly Indian land west of that hard line in the states that you see here. But the most important thing about this is the fact that all land must now be surrendered to the crown. And that, of course, didn't survive the American Revolution in the States, but it did survive in Canada. And treaties were signed across Canada with various groups starting in the 1700s. And so the Williams Treaty and the Mississauga, I should really start with the Mississauga, but the Williams Treaty are 7 nations that owned these lands depicted on this map in conjunction with Mississaugas of the Credit. These are the Mississauga that lived to the east and their northern Chippewayan neighbors. So collectively, they're called Anishinaabe. So here, once the Mississauga come into Ontario and kick out the Haudenosaunee, after the Haudenosaunee have kicked out the Wendat, this is where you get the Anishinaabe inclusion in the Toronto Land Acknowledgement. This is the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation land cessations. And you can see the Toronto Purchase here, which is the one that was settled. We all kind of watched this happen in 2010. They got $145 million as the final settlement for the lands of Toronto and further north into, just north of Richmond Hill. And the black line you see there is what they refer to as their traditional territory. So that's area they use traditionally, they say, not treaty land, but area they used traditionally. So the Huron-Wendat created a line, the red line, which is a hard and fast line, that's our area, our traditional territory area. The yellow line is area that they also used to the north, but they didn't have many major settlements in the yellow area. This is the area of the Treaty of the Nanfan Treaty, the one that the British signed with the Haudenosaunee signed with the British, assuming the British would at one day have the whole area. And a colleague of mine found the dotted line map about 15 years ago in the British archives, which is roughly this brown area on this map. And the Haudenosaunee use this today as a bargaining tool when they're talking about infringement on their traditional territory by various things like land development. I mentioned the Algonquins, who were allies of the Hurons against the Haudenosaunee in New York State. City of Ottawa and most of the Ottawa Valley was never ceded properly. And so the Algonquins are in a day-to-day negotiation and have been for 10 years with the federal government to settle that. They're getting very close, I must say. And then when the Haudenosaunee returned to Southern Ontario in 1784, they set up the Tyendinaga Reserve in Eastern Ontario, but also the Grand River Tract, the Haldimand Tract, which is 6 miles either side of the Grand from source to mouth. So by the 19th century, a lot of that land had been sold by Joseph Brant and other Haudenosaunee people. And then in the 19th century, we had the Indian Act. We had 2,500 reserves established across Canada. It was cradle to grave legislation. You hear that term. This is what this means. You had an agent assigned to each reserve. And basically, people in these reserves did not have the vote in Canada until 1960s. So the policy of enfranchisement became a policy under Duncan Campbell Scott. That's where we got the residential schools. And of course, most recently completed in 2015 was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we finally recognized the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and equity for Indigenous people in the legal system. But 2 particular calls to action, one of them calling on an educational mandate to try and provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples. Aboriginal is used here because it's a term used in the Constitution, whereas most people use the term Indigenous now. But there was also a call on business and reconciliation. And so that work that I do with Carolyn King, reaching out to corporations and municipalities, is about addressing these 2 TRC recommendations. That's what that's about. So with that, we probably want to take a break. I can put the land acknowledgement back on if you like, but you will see that what I have explained to you is the presence of all those various nations and people in the Toronto land acknowledgement. But I think you would agree with me, few people don't have an appreciation for all the history that creates those people being there and the difference between treaty rights and traditional territory. One thing I did not mention, and it'll be my last comment before Daphne yanks the mic away from me, is that all nations have a constitutional right defined in the courts to manage their own archaeological records. That was settled in a case some time ago. So when you hear people talk about archaeological sites, First Nations people talk about archaeological sites and their rights, they have a constitutional right to manage that. It's not our decision, it's theirs.